Good evening and welcome to Fresh Natural Live. We have a great show as usual for you tonight. I hope your Monday. This is May 23rd, 2022. I hope it's going well for you. My Monday was busy. We're going to talk about a very common and important topic. It's going to be related to diabetes. And the topic's going to be related to inflammation and diabetes. And I hope to give you some insight in terms of the underlying cause of diabetes. Many people suffer from type 2 diabetes. The vast majority of people suffer from type 2 diabetes. There's a small percentage of people, approximately 5%, who suffer from type 1 diabetes. And it's really a common disorder that leads to lots of problems, leads to heart disease, stroke, peripheral vascular disease. It's one of the leading causes of amputation. And although there are lots of medications that are used to treat patients with type 2 diabetes as well as type 1 diabetes, there's a simple lifestyle approach that you can take. And what we're going to do is talk about the underlying mechanisms, because as I've said many times before, we should understand how our bodies work and how they function normally and how they malfunction. And so the important thing is to get this understanding. So we're going to share a lot of this with you tonight. Get your pen and pencils out. There's going to be some technical aspects of this talk, but I'm going to actually connect some concepts that are made with a previous talk. So stay tuned for our interesting show on diabetes. Okay, so as I said before, we're going to talk about diabetes, and I have a few interesting PowerPoint slides to share with you. But before we go on, I want you to give us a thumbs up. Let's all, on the count of 3, give us a thumbs up. If you hadn't had a chance to like and share this, please do so, and also subscribe. So 1, 2, 3, thumbs up. I see we get 1 heart here. Give us some love. Let us help steer that YouTube algorithm to get more people to look at our show. So before I go on with more discussion on our favorite topic, diabetes, because it's such a common disorder, and as a cardiologist, I get lots of patients that have problems with diabetes. I want to bring back a very special guest. And really, she isn't a guest. I mean, she was part of the panel. I don't think we've ever let it go because we hadn't even taken a picture off the intro. So anyway, without further ado, I want to introduce or reintroduce Isosa E. Isosa, how are you doing this evening? Oh, you're still on mute. I know you're going in and out of mute.
I'm good. How are you, Dr. Montgomery?
Just fine. Isosa is she and her fiance is visiting us here in Houston, and I had the pleasure to visit with them this weekend. We went to the farmers market. They've been doing some things around town, and they've got a special project. I'm not going to say anything about it because she says she don't want to talk about a project that hadn't started yet. So, but they have a special project they're going to be working on, and we're going to be giving you more information about that later in the year. But until then, we'll keep you in a little bit of suspense. But Isosa decided to join us. She's in a Starbucks, so she's going to be going in and out of mute because there's a lot of activity behind her. But welcome back, and don't be such
Thank you.
Anyway, so what I'm going to do is part 1 of this discussion. I'm just going to give an overview on inflammation and diabetes. Now, remember, I think about 2 weeks ago, maybe 1 or 2 weeks ago, however long it was, we talked about inflammation in the heart. And now I'm talking about inflammation and diabetes, and I'm going to actually connect those two. In fact, I pulled one of the slides from that discussion and I put it in this slide deck, and I'll share that with you as we go through the conversation. But I think it's important for us to understand that these disease states are not all just separate, things going on. There's a common denominator to these disease states. So let's talk about inflammation in diabetes. And I want to underscore how to reverse it. Now, just getting to some of the basics, the two basic types of diabetes that we think about. Now, in medicine, we like to put things in little simple buckets, type 1, type 2, A, B, that type of thing. And even though this is a reasonable conceptual way of thinking about diabetes, you have primarily one where there's an impaired production of insulin, and primarily type 2, which is there's an impairment of response to insulin. There's a lot of overlap in both of these, and we'll talk about a little bit of that later. But type 1 is the lack of insulin production. It's caused by an immune-mediated mechanism. Now, keep your mind, put a pin in that. So there's an immune-mediated mechanism. The environmental triggers such as infection, nutrition, chemicals, etc., abnormal immune response that targets their own insulin-producing cells. So basically, your immune system, which is supposed to protect you, in this case, attacks you. And it attacks beta cells, which are the cells that produce insulin inside the pancreas. And hence, the pancreas doesn't produce adequate amounts of insulin. Now, when I was in medical school, we looked at type 1 diabetes was, childhood diabetes, or adolescent diabetes. And when I was on the pediatric ward, these kids would come in. They would come in with what's called diabetic ketoacidosis. We give them insulin, and we give them IV fluids. And in essence, what we would do is that we would bring down the acid level in the blood and get the blood sugar under control. And then they would go on insulin for the rest of their lives, quote unquote. And in this situation, we looked at it as an autoimmune reaction. Oftentimes, the kids would have what's called a viral syndrome, so flu-like symptoms, fever, chills, etc., a number of days prior to the onset of this. And so we would attribute it to this viral syndrome being some kind of an autoimmune mechanism attacking the pancreas, and hence the kid, after the pancreas is overwhelmed, the beta islet cells are either dead or very weak, and they're not producing insulin. Hence, the kids would require insulin infusion. Type 2 diabetes, on the other hand, is you can think of it as the opposite. So the pancreas theoretically makes insulin, and let's just say theoretically makes adequate insulin, although that's not necessarily true in the real world. But it's not so much the inability of the pancreas to make insulin, but it's an inability of the body's tissues, such as skeletal muscle and livers, to recognize the insulin. So when peripheral cells and tissues are resistant to insulin, they can't take in glucose. So basically, insulin is like the key that unlocks the glucose cells receptors. And so if you want to walk through a door, you have to have a key, unlock the door, and you walk through. The insulin molecules can be thought of as that key that unlocks the door opens, and the glucose walks through or passes through. And all cells have receptors that can communicate with the bloodstream, and molecules pass back and forth through these receptors. So insulin receptors or glucose receptors are very similar. So you have an insulin receptor adjacent to a glucose receptor, and so the insulin receptor is stimulated, the glucose door opens up, and the glucose passes through. If the insulin receptor is not stimulated, the glucose door doesn't open, so glucose can't pass through so easily, and so the glucose remains in the bloodstream, and therefore the blood glucose goes up. And so the insulin is an important molecule for that. So type 1, inadequate insulin production. Type 2, inadequate recognition of the insulin. And so glucose can't pass through. A good analogy would be if you have somebody in type 1, you have two people speaking to each other. And type 1, the speaker, the one talking to the other person, has a very low voice or no voice, and this person can't hear because no sound is going out. Type 2 would be this person speaks normally, but this person's hard of hearing. So adequate sound is going out, but it's not being received very well. So that's another analogy to think of it. Now, this latent autoimmune disease is kind of a 1.5 diabetes. We try to lump things in buckets. What I'm going to do is kind of give you a discussion of what this latent autoimmune disease is. But suffice it to say that 95% of people in the population have type 2 diabetes. And it used to be where children, if a child had diabetes, it was type 1 and type 2 is adult onset. We can't use those labels anymore because now more children are getting type 2 diabetes, and we'll talk about why. Here's a diagram showing a schematic in terms of the mechanism. So in type 1, you have the pancreatic islet cells. Okay, here's a normal islet cells, but then if they're attacked and destroyed by inflammatory molecules, antibodies, and immune cells, then these islet cells no longer function normally, so they don't produce adequate amounts of insulin. So you have lots of scarring there. So you have impaired insulin production. Type 2 diabetes, you have the pancreas and you're producing these insulin molecules, and here's the glucose molecules. So insulin moves glucose cells. Now here it's showing the insulin moving the cells into, it really has the insulin. This diagram is a little bit off because the insulin molecules attach to the cells and then allows the glucose molecules going through. But in general, the schematic is saying that the insulin allows the glucose to get across the cells, which is true. However, in type 2 diabetes, there's a resistance to insulin. And so the cells resist the insulin receptors, and so less glucose goes across, and you have increased glucose molecules left in the blood. So inflammation type 1, what I want to share with you is immune cells called macrophages release inflammatory molecules called cytokines. Hopefully, if you saw the talk that we did on inflammation of the heart, you may remember some of these terms, cytokines, for instance. And these cytokines are, as I said before, are signaling molecules that trigger more inflammatory responses. They call in more inflammation cells. Such molecules such as TNF alpha, IL-1 beta, and reactive oxygen species. These are free radicals here. This is a cytokine. These are cytokine-like molecules. And so they cause inflammation. It's a cascade of events. So it's like an alarm that goes off, and more fire trucks are called to the fire scene. Despite how big or small the fire is, you get an overwhelming response. Now, there are many pathways responsible for type 1 diabetes. There's different trials that tested immune-modifying drugs. They're always looking for drugs to address these things. And so what happens is that they've looked at vitamin D analogs. Etanercept is an anti-TNF alpha drug that increases insulin production, lowers hemoglobin A1C. So you can get some drugs that has an interim effect. However, you may not get the overall benefit, and also drugs can have side effects. So those type 1 diabetes mellitus patients need insulin to regulate their blood. So typically, these individuals are on insulin for life. I will talk about some type 1 diabetic patients that I've treated before. I just threw in here a slide from a previous talk, and the reason I did this is to bring up some of the common things. Those of you who saw my heart failure inflammation talk may remember this slide. Excuse me. But what I want to do is talk about some of the same things. You have effectors of pro-inflammatory cytokines. Pro-inflammatory cytokines, what? IL-1 beta and TNF alpha. They also induce systolic and diastolic dysfunction. So these same cytokine mediators that have an effect on diabetes or have an effect on heart failure. And like I said before, acute heart failure is essentially a cytokine storm of the cardiovascular system. So if you think of the cytokine heart failure being a cytokine storm of the cardiovascular system, an acute onset of type 1 diabetes is a cytokine storm of the pancreas, or you could have a cytokine storm of the metabolic system. So I just threw that in there to show the connection. The effects of obesity and excess adipose tissue. It can have an adverse effect on the liver. Now, that's important because the liver is a major organ for metabolism. And diabetes, I often tell my patients, diabetes isn't a blood sugar disease, it's a metabolic disease, or it's a blood vessel disease and a metabolism disease. And the key center for that is liver dysfunction. And oftentimes, when I'm looking at evaluating patients, and they have some, insulin resistance. They may not have full-blown diabetes. They may have a little bit of lipid dysfunction. I'm looking at that collectively as a metabolic dysfunction related to liver dysfunction. And so then what are some of the issues you think about with liver dysfunction? Well, fatty liver buildup is an important thing. We're talking about a lot. You see a lot of people with, fatty liver. There's a fat buildup in the liver called steatosis. It contributes to steatosis. That's just a fancy medical term, which essentially results in congestion. You have bile duct and biliary flow. And when you impair biliary flow, you get steatosis. You can also have inflammation of the cells, the liver cells or hepatic cells. And when they become inflammation, they have hepatitis. That's the term, inflammation of hepatocytes or liver cells. And then you can lead to progression of cirrhosis in the liver. So you have an early impairment of liver dysfunction, which contributes to metabolic dysfunction, which contributes to insulin resistance. You have fat accumulation in the pancreas, which can cause dysfunction in insulin. You have inflammatory cytokines that release and cause damage to lining of arteries. We talked about that in our cardiovascular talk. And these cytokines inflame the myocardium. So when you look at a condition like diabetes, you say, well, okay, this person has diabetes. Well, they don't just have isolated problems. In the previous slides I gave you said, well, type 1 is, the pancreas having trouble. And type 2, the liver and skeletal muscle having problems. But it's not just those organs. Those are some key areas where you have a clinical manifestation of problems. But when you have this underlying inflammatory process, you have fatty buildup in multiple different organs. You have scar buildup in multiple different organs. And so there's a synergistic effect of dysfunction that's happening. And so what's happening is that these cytokines, TNF alpha, IL-6, IL-1 beta, reactive oxygen species, these are the same old characters. We saw them last time. We talked about inflammation of the heart. Now we're talking about them again with diabetes, type 1 and type 2. And so these inflammatory markers are happening at the cellular level. In this case, it's the beta cell. They lead to beta cell death. In the case of myocardial problems, heart failure, they lead to myocyte death, which leads to weak hearts or heart disease or heart attacks, etc., or heart rhythm problems. So you have the same underlying mechanism that's causing different disease states and resulting in different manifestations. TNF alpha causes peripheral insulin resistance. Studies show that IL-16 is a predictor of progression of type 2 diabetes. Visceral fat, fat around organs. Now, again, we talked about fat in the liver, fat in the pancreas, fat in the viscera. It produces pro-inflammatory cytokines like TNF alpha, IL-6, IL-1 beta, and reactive oxygen. Same old characters, same old characters. These guys they're like, Bonnie, Clyde, and, the gang of four going around causing disease all over the body, same old suspects. But what's leading to these suspects? Well, remember we talked about, in the other discussion, we talked about underlying mechanisms from the cellular standpoint. Let's look at the fat buildup. Why is it the body builds up fat? And why does the body swell in interstitial spaces? The body builds up fat because when we put toxins in our system at a rate that's fast and our body can remove the toxins, the body has to store the toxins within itself. So, for example, and I think I gave this analogy before. Let's say you have your house and your front and backyard, and normally you take your trash out, when you build up trash in the house and you put it in your trash can outdoors, and then the trash truck comes and picks it up once a week. So you have a certain amount of trash you put out. Now, I remember I had all four of my kids here. We used to have 2 trash cans out, and we'll fill up 2 trash cans. They come and dump out 2 trash cans. But if you have a lot of kids and a lot of trash coming in, so, you get tons and tons of trash coming in every day. You got to move the trash out of the house. You can't have it in the house. You got to get it out of the house. So you have to put it in trash cans, but the 2 trash cans fill up. You got to get more trash cans. And so you get so much trash that comes in the house. When you move it out, you got to buy 50 trash cans. So your house has 50, 60 trash cans around it. And maybe you got 60, 70 trash cans. But the trash man is only going to dump 1 or 2 at a time. So you build all these trash cans, you bring in more trash in, and you're unloading 2 trash cans a week. But you may be filling up 6 trash cans a week. So as you fill up 6 trash cans a week, you're only unloading 2. You're getting a net 4 trash cans per week. So every week you have to buy 4 new trash cans to fill up the trash. Well, guess what? These trash cans are analogous to the fat cells. So if you're putting in toxins from the bad food you're eating and soft drinks and other bad things you're taking in, you're putting in more toxins than the body can release. The body removes toxins through the GI system. It can remove it through the skin. You breathe out certain toxins. You remove it through the liver, the colon, intestines. And so you can only release or remove a certain amount of toxins. But if you're putting more toxin in can you release than you can remove, then the body has to store those toxins somewhere. Where do they store those toxins? Typically, fat cells is one common way. So the body creates more fat cells to put toxins in. But these toxic fat cells are pro-inflammatory in of themselves. So they release more, they trigger more inflammation because they're loaded with toxins. The body's immune system says, well, something smells bad around here. Let's go and find something to fight. And so you have these fat cells that you're building up. And so oftentimes people get fat, not only because they're consuming, excess calories, but it's really because they're consuming excess toxins. And it just so happened that high caloric foods are high toxic foods. So toxins are associated with the calories of the food. But you have a lot of people who reduce their calories, but they still build up waste because they may be still consuming toxic foods. And therefore, the body still has to stabilize or remove or neutralize these toxins. So that's what you're getting when you have this buildup of peripheral gut flora. Peripheral fat, fat both in organs and also fat in the viscera. Now, what about your gut flora, gut microbiota in type 2 diabetes? We talk about gut flora and the microbiome a fair amount. It's an important area. And if you remember when I talk about the mechanisms of disease, we talk about inflammation, we talk about oxidative stress. The other major mechanism, which may be more foundational than the first two, is the abnormal microbiome. And so our diet influences the composition of our gut flora. That's the bacteria found in the gastrointestinal system. Now, we have bacteria all over our body. We have probably about 10 times bacterial cells than we have innate human cells. And this microbiome, this ecosystem, if you will, is really important for our body's function. It's important for our normal body's function. The gut flora affects our immune system in the gut. The microbial products called lipopolysaccharides. Again, these are some molecules we can measure. They cause low-grade inflammation. I bet there are probably hundreds of other molecules that we don't measure or have yet to discover that contributes to inflammation as well. Patients with diabetes often have elevated lipopolysaccharide levels. So you want to reduce this. Now, they've done studies where you demonstrate fecal microbiome transplantation from lean donors to insulin-resistant subjects, resulting in improvement in metabolic syndrome. So, it's sort of, you got the fat diabetics taking crap off the skinny folks and getting better from it. But anyway, below are different ways to reduce lipopolysaccharides. You can consume prebiotics, consume probiotics, consume polyphenols and plant foods, consume omega-3 fatty acids. Well, guess what? And we can give you omega-3 fatty acids, but they're natural foods. Raw plants and seeds have omega-3 fatty acids. Raw plants are probiotics. And so, I hate to sound like a broken record, but when you eat raw plant-based foods, they're adequate probiotics and prebiotics. They feed the microbiome. And then when you take away the dead animal flesh, you take away the chemicals and processed foods, you do several things. One, the chemicals and processed foods and the animal protein contributes to an abnormal gut flora, first and foremost. Secondarily, they cause outward problems such as elevated blood pressure, arthritis, and other conditions that contributes to your need for pharmacological agents, which also have an adverse effect on the gut flora. So the consumption of a bad food diet contributes both directly to an adverse effect of the microbiome, but also indirectly because it forces you have to take other pharmacological agents that also have an adverse effect on the microbiome. For example, acetaminophen, from the drug Tylenol, people know, has an adverse effect on the microbiome. has abnormal effect on the mitochondria. So, drugs that we have to take for inflammation and other ailments, we can avoid having to take these drugs if our diet is optimal. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Well, short chain fatty acids also affect insulin resistance, but these are the good guys. So if you have healthy bacteria in the colon, they produce short chain fatty acids, and these improve glucose and insulin resistance. So it has a favorable effect. Foods that lead to production of short chain fatty acids in the colon, things such as resistant starches, onions, leeks, garlic, apples, asparagus, and oranges. You don't see cheeseburger on here, or barbecue or oxtails. These are things that you see that are all plant-based foods. So similar to inflammation type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes mellitus, immune cells called macrophages release inflammatory molecules that damage insulin-producing cells in the pancreas. So even though type 2 diabetes is primarily a mechanism of insulin resistance, the underlying inflammatory process that's affecting the liver, that's affecting the skeletal muscles, can also affect the pancreas. So patients with type 2 diabetes, even though theoretically they have insulin resistance, they also have an impairment of insulin production. It may not be as severe as someone with type 1 diabetes, in which case it's severe, sudden onset of inflammation, and it could be total destruction of the pancreas. And in many cases, it doesn't improve or recover. And so these people are on insulin lifelong. But an individual with type 2 can have a progressive destruction of the pancreas and beta cell dysfunction. And they can have sort of, as they call it, 1.5, to have both impairment of insulin and also insulin resistance. I've treated a number of patients who are kind of in this boat. And we sometimes struggle getting them off insulin because their pancreas, although it's not totally dead, is severely impaired. When I work with these patients, I try to detox them aggressively to aggressively reduce the inflammatory process to help the pancreas recover. Some of these people who are considered adults with type 1 may not be fully adults with type 1. I remember treating a patient years ago who, and she was actually, gosh, I'm thinking in her, so this is back, she had an electrical disconnect there. She was in her maybe 20s, could have been mid-20s, late 20s. So she was labeled as a type 1 diabetic. And so I think she was in her 20s, maybe mid to late 20s. But anyway, so I saw her, and she came in, and she was on insulin, and she said, well, I'm a type 1 diabetic. So I said, well, tell me about your history. So she said, well, yeah, when I was 8 years old or whatever, I was at, some event, a picnic or whatever with the family, and somebody checked my blood sugar. I just felt a little weak or something. They checked my blood sugar. It was like 500 or 600. So they took me to the doctor, and the doctor, you need insulin. And they said, you're type 1 diabetic. And so at that time, she was carrying the diagnosis of type 1 diabetes. So I said, well, I was a little skeptical because I know kids can get type 2 diabetes. So, okay, I'll tell you what, let's do this. Let's put you on a detox, and we'll check your insulin very closely. After the first week, the blood sugars were dropping. So I said, I'll tell you what, let's do this. Only give yourself insulin if your blood sugar is above 200. And we typically have a protocol that's similar to that. And we follow them weekly with intermittent phone calls, et cetera. She came back on week 2 after 2 weeks of detox. She had not taken insulin for that whole second week. And I told her, you're not a type 1 diabetic, you're type 2 diabetic. Because a true type 1 diabetic cannot go really 24, 36 hours without insulin, unless the blood sugar go up. And so she was a clear type 2, and I think she was always a type 2. Now, I've had some patients who we aggressively detox, and we have a harder time getting them off insulin. I think there's sort of a 1.5, and I think in some of them, we've had situations we've taken longer to get them off insulin, but we've been able to get them off insulin, and they're really a 1.5. But what happens is that they get recovery of the pancreas. And so even though the pancreas is impaired severely, and it can produce a small amount of insulin, but not enough for them to go off insulin, as we continue to detox, the pancreas improves. So the inflammation and fatty infiltration of the pancreas allows the pancreas to recover. So in some cases, you have a combination of type 1, type 2, and in some cases, the pancreas is not all the way dead. It's weakened and impaired, it's overinflamed, but it can recover under the right conditions. And so although it's convenient to give these simple definitions and separations, it's always good to understand the underlying mechanism. Mechanism type 1 is impaired pancreatic function. Mechanism type 2 is impaired peripheral cell or tissue cell function, such as skeletal muscle and liver, that receives glucose. And so the impairment, the extent of the impairment is the key. So when you talk about reversing something, it depends on where you are. Can type 1 diabetes be reversed? Well, if it's a true type 1 and the pancreas is dead, let's say, for instance, somebody had the pancreas surgically removed, so it's no pancreas. Well, then, no, it can't be reversed. You don't have a pancreas. If you have an immune process that completely destroys the pancreas, knocks it out cold, and it's down for the punch, it's all scarred up, the beta cells are dead, not able to come back, then yeah, that's type 1, it can't come back. But you can have a severe type 1 where there's an ongoing immune process and the pancreas is very suppressed, and maybe the pancreas is hibernating where it produces tiny amounts of insulin or no insulin. But then let's say, for instance, under the right conditions, nutritional detox, anti-inflammatory diet, the inflammation goes away and that pancreas may come back to life. Can it come back to life to produce enough insulin for that person to go off insulin? Theoretically, it's possible. And so that's why I like to think of mechanism as opposed to saying, well, type 1, type 2, etc. Type 2, pure type 2, is very responsive to nutritional intervention. In fact, type 2 diabetes is probably one of the most responsive diseases to a plant-based diet that I know of. In that situation, insulin resistance can be reversed greatly with plant-based diet and natural things. But there are other things you can do. Exercise is important. As I said, consuming a plant-based diet can lower hemoglobin A1C. I've shown you our data where we put them on a defined plant-based diet. These are patients who are not type 2 diabetics but have insulin resistance. They have increased BMI, hypertension, hyperlipidemia. So they have that so-called metabolic syndrome. We've shown a 3.4% reduction in hemoglobin A1C in just 4 weeks. And that's because the fluctuations in blood sugar is reduced. And that's why you reduce the hemoglobin A1C in such a short period of time. It's important to consume a wide variety of vegetables, avoid consuming high glycemic index foods. Now, we are pretty liberal with the consumption of fruits early on with our diabetics. However, we see how they do, and most of the times they do pretty well. So we don't fuss over the glycemic index early on a raw detox. If they have trouble, then we'll back off on the high glycemic index foods. But that's just kind of a clinical judgment thing that we make in our facility. We try to avoid saturated fats, code term for animal fats, animal products, processed foods, and other refined sugars. Those things are abnormal chemical molecules. And so even though you may have something that's quote unquote vegan, it could be a processed food, it could be fried, overly microwave or whatever, and have chemical dyes, preservatives, etc., and can be very problematic. And exercise is very important. Exercise increases insulin receptor activity and decreases insulin resistance. And so exercise is very important. It has other metabolic benefits, detox, sweating, increased core temperature, and the like. So thanks for your attention, for putting up with another one of my interesting PowerPoint slides. I'm going to let us take a break here. So you have any comments real quick before we go to break, Sosa?
I just love what you were saying. Someone put a comment saying it was a really great explanation about storing fat and toxins. And I agree with that. I used to tell people before I became a nutritionist that weight was waste. And I feel like you just explained that in a really good way. Like people can understand that you can reduce your weight just by reducing your toxic intake.
Yeah, I think I agree. And I think we try to think of just burning calories. And I mean, calories are calories, but I think that the mechanism, the biochemistry of those calories are really important. And I think it's a good point. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back, and I hope you've been tracking some of the comments. We're going to track your comments and address any questions, and I'm going to get some more insight from Esosa. So hang on for part 2.